Mark Rogers TV, always talking Ohio State football with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry. And of course, the Buckeyes season ended in not so good a fashion, but the recruiting situation looking good. We will have plenty of coverage on that over the next 2 weeks as we head toward National Signing Day. But we'd like to talk about scheduling tonight with Brandon. How you doing tonight, Brandon?
I'm doing great, Mark. How about yourself?
Doing great. So this is always an intriguing topic because if I had my way, Brandon, this is the way it would shake out. We would take scheduling completely out of the hands of the schools so that they couldn't push their own agendas, and it would go into a formula, much like the NFL. But instead of the NFL opting to push parity, therefore an imbalanced schedule toward the weaker teams, I would build a balanced schedule, meaning your non-conference opponents would be based on last year's records similar to your opponents across the nation. So everyone would have like non-conference schedules, but that's maybe in another lifetime that I get my way. We'll talk about Ohio State's schedule coming up here in 2017 and a lot of oddities here, Brandon. So the first thing that jumps out at anybody who knows the way the Big Ten is scheduled down through the years, and the Big Ten it being staunched in tradition more so than I think any other league in the country, took a long time before there was a championship game where the popularity begged for it years before. It was a long time before they even played after Thanksgiving because that was always tradition, and the team had to sit around to play the national championship. Obviously, Ohio State knew that more than anyone else. And now we have a Big Ten opener for Ohio State for the first time that I'm aware of. And I didn't go through the list, but I'm going through my head, and I don't remember a Big Ten opener for Ohio State in particular, or really anyone in the Big Ten. And then on top of that, it's a Thursday night game.
Yes, they definitely threw a wrench into things for next year because, like I said, they start off against Indiana, which is, as everyone knows, a fellow Big Ten team, and then also on a Thursday night. So it's just a completely different scenario than Ohio State's ever had to deal with. You factor in, too, that by luck with this schedule, with them starting off against the Hoosiers, and then you think about how the Buckeyes just brought in Kevin Wilson as their offensive coordinator, who's the former coach at Indiana. It's going to be a lot of anticipation for this game. There's always anticipation by the Buckeye fan base for the Buckeyes to play, but I think this one's going to be even more because it's a conference game, much like the SEC does, where they usually have like a South Carolina start on Thursday. So Big Ten, I think, is trying to jump on that, try to get some of that money that the SEC kind of gets all of it there, because usually they are really the only conference that is playing on Thursday before opening weekend. So, college football is just all about the money. So Jim Delaney is jumping on that money train.
Yeah, they're definitely the only conference that plays conference games. I believe Minnesota took on Oregon State. They had a TCU game a couple of years ago. Indiana will play like an FCS school, Indiana State, somebody like that. There'll be a couple Thursday, Friday night games. Michigan State's jumped in there with a Friday night game the first week or two, but they're very insignificant games and have been. But Ohio State, Indiana going at it in Bloomington. Obviously, there's the rematch against Oklahoma. There's an Army team who is traditionally down, but coming off an extremely strong season and a bowl victory, including the win. Most importantly, anyone knows anything about college football, and maybe not even college football, the win over Navy means everything. And UNLV are the three non-conference foes.
Yeah, the Sooners is the game that everyone's going to be circling. Once again, that's game number 2. So Kevin Wilson starts off against his former team, the Hoosiers, goes into game 2 against his other former team, the Sooners. So you're going to have 2 top 10 ranked teams probably. It's going to be in Columbus this year. So that's the big one that everyone's going to be looking forward to. Army following that is those service teams. Any triple option team always gives teams heartburn, especially early on in the season. Especially when you've got a big game after them or a big game right before them. You can't really focus on it too much because you've got other big games going on. So those Army, Navy, Air Force games always kind of give me worry as a fan. and then UNLV. So it's not a great out of conference schedule. I think you've got Oklahoma as your signature team, which Ohio State always tries to get at least one signature team, and they're out of conference. It doesn't always work out, much like you were kind of talking about there. I agree with the scheduling thing. My big thing with changing schedules is I wouldn't prog them so far out. Sort of like what you were talking about, doing it like right before the season starts, and then try to get a schedule going there. Because it's just too hard to guess who's going to be good. You look at Ohio State when they scheduled Cal. Cal was a top 10 team. By the time that they actually got around to playing the Buckeyes, Cal was far from a top 10 team, so it made their out-of-conference bad. So this year I think they got good out-of-conference because the Sooners are good, and Army just happens to be a lot better than they've been in a very long time. You look at the coming years, they've got a home and away starting next year with TCU. You've also got Oregon State on the schedule. Down the road, you've got Oregon, you've got Notre Dame, Texas, Boston College. So there's a bunch of big name teams there. You just don't know how good they'll be out in 2023, which is scheduled out to.
Yeah, so if you close the window, as you suggest, then you don't eliminate, but you limit the chance of getting a team showing up during a down period when you're looking for a marquee matchup. You also have probably, obviously, a much better chance of scheduling a big-time team if it's Alabama, Oklahoma, Clemson, USC. Not that they don't have down years. Yes, if you're under the age of 20, Alabama has had down years, actually 3-8 or 3-9 about 10 years ago. But if you schedule the Tennessees of the world, if you schedule the
Virginia Techs,
the Virginia Techs of the world, then you could have a top 10 team in your backyard, or you could have a team that's going to win 5 or 6 games that year. So obviously there's some level of projection where you can go with some certain matchups, but there's only so many Alabamas and Floridas out there and Oklahomas and USCs. And even though, again, those teams have been down, but this 2023, I hate to jump way ahead, could be really difficult because Texas and Notre Dame overlap. So there's in 2022 and 23, the Buckeyes could be really rough on themselves, or it could be light, but most likely, hey, there will be no way to fault Ohio State at that point, regardless of where Notre Dame and Texas stand, because they tried. Notre Dame and Texas back-to-back years, and that 2023 schedule also includes Boston College, who could be decent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just so hard to know. And as much as I sit here and look at 2022 and 2023 with Notre Dame and Texas and kind of get excited about the possibility of that, the chances of, I think, both of those teams still being on the schedule by the time it comes around in 2022, it just never seems to work out that way. It just always seems that if teams have too many of those huge out-of-conference teams, for some reason, somebody drops off the schedule. So, I mean, especially like you said, 2023 with Boston College, Texas, and Notre Dame, all three of those teams are either really good or good quality. In Boston College's case, that's could be a big one, but you just never know. I mean, we're still 6-7 years out from this. So much could change by the time it rolls around. The best team they've got on there could be Southern Miss or something, so it's fun to talk about. We just never know how these teams are going to go. It's always just gamble, and that's why I think it should just be schedules are made 1 or 2 years out and try to get it set up and do a home and away with these teams, and you just get a better chance of knowing who you've got coming in.
Yeah, Oregon looked like a top 5 program for 6 or 7 years. Now, 1 year removed from a pretty good team 2 years ago that went 9-4. This looks like a bad game, but who knows? They bounce back, and there's 3 to 4 seasons to get ready for Oregon and see what kind of matchup that is. I think the same applies for TCU coming off a 6-7 campaign. Yeah. They were one of the best teams in the country just a couple of years ago. So who knows what's going to happen with Oregon and TCU. They're obviously not elite programs, but they have the wherewithal and the resources, depending on who's in place and who the coach is, to get them to a place where they're elite on occasion or on a particular year. So you could be running into one of the best teams in the country or a pretty marginal Pac-12 or Big 12 team.
Yep. And then another one that Buckeye fans are kind of looking forward to is 2019 when Cincinnati comes to town, led by Luke Fickell and possibly Torrance Gibson, who just transferred out of Ohio State. So who knows how Fickell will have Cincinnati by then. But that's one, looking just a few years down the road that could turn out to be a huge game, especially between two Ohio teams, depending on how well Luke Fickell is able to do out there.
And then finally, the other thing I look at is obviously when you've got a 14-team league and you play 9 games, used to be 8 in the Big Ten, but in 2016 they moved it up to a 9-game schedule. You still miss 4 teams. So who do you play in the other division is huge. Iowa went undefeated 2 years ago. No Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State on the schedule from the East Division. I think that had something to do with it. Next year, you automatically look to see from the Western Division, is Wisconsin on the schedule? They're not on the schedule. No Wisconsin, no Minnesota. You get Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois. Considering the configuration of that division, that seems pretty fair. You get 2 of the better teams in the division and 1 of the lesser teams. So that seems pretty fair in regards to weighting the schedule for one of the heavyweights, obviously, in the East.
Well, and that's where conference schedule is always going to be a question for people, because it's just impossible the way it's set up right now for a team to play every team within their conference. So you will always run into the question of, I think it was there for, I know you would know better than I do, but wasn't it like 5 years straight where I think it was Alabama and Georgia didn't play, and those were like 2 of the top 3 or 4 teams in the conference. It's just the way the schedule worked out. It wasn't like Bama was ducking them or Georgia was ducking Bama. It just is the way it works out when you just are unable to play everyone. So the Big Ten is going to go through the same things. Right now, the way Ohio State sits, it looks like the East Conference is, the stronger conference. So they're going to face everyone in the East with the Penn States and the Michigans next year. And if Michigan State can figure things out again, on the West side, just like you were saying, the Badgers are the big team. I mean, they're the ones that have consistently been good for really the past 10, 15 years. The Cornhuskers look like they're kind of starting to figure things out again. So they got the Cornhuskers next year. They don't have the Badgers. And I think those are the 2 out West that the Buckeyes really have to worry about. Yeah,
the one aspect of Big Ten scheduling that makes it more reasonable and allows the schedulers to make it more fair based on the previous year's results and anticipating what was going to happen the next year, that's different from the SEC and the ACC, is that they have cross-division rivalries, and the only one that exists in the Big Ten is to pair up Indiana and Purdue to keep up with the Old Oak and Bucket rivalry, which I have no issue with. But otherwise, it's selecting 3 entirely new different teams. For example, in the SEC, if you're Mississippi State, you always play Kentucky. Does that make any sense? No, but it's wedged in because they're trying to put other rivalries together. And then there's about 3 teams that don't have rivalries in the other division, so they just match them with somebody. And basically, if you get Kentucky, you get a fairly easy break compared to everything else in the SEC. And my one scheduling note that I'll bring up, Brandon, because you took me down that road and I'll take advantage, that's an oddity that the Big Ten can avoid, is because of those tie-ins. 1 year in the SEC, this was about 3 or 4 years ago, when clearly Bama and LSU were that heavyweight matchup, toe-to-toe. 1 year, the 2 teams that LSU played in the other division, in the East Division, went a combined 14-2 the year before. They were 7-1, 7-1, Georgia, Florida. The 2 teams that Alabama played from the year before were 2-14 the year before, 1-7, 1-7. So in a league where you only have 8 conference games and 2 of them are that separated by record, you have completely created a scheduling nightmare and a disparity in the schedule that's unfair.
Yeah, and then even with that, you can think about too, where I know Ohio State fans are still a little bitter about bye weeks and how bye weeks are set up. I know Alabama and LSU have gone through this too, where you'll have multiple weeks in a row where teams have a bye week coming into play, and so that's another thing that teams have to deal with. But it's just it's going to happen the way conferences are set up right now. I know Ohio State, even before the season started, were kind of nervous about going into Madison to face the Badgers with them coming off bye week, and then the next week going into College Station to face Penn State with them coming off a bye week. And you saw Penn State won that one. And so really, I think the better team should win regardless of if a team's coming off of a bye week. Coaching and talented players should prevail there. It doesn't always work like that, and I know fans would love to just turn to the bye week and blame it on that. But I think the bye week matters, of course, because they get the extra week to prepare. But that's just another point of contention for some fans out there.
All right, we're kicking around Ohio State's 2017 schedule and beyond with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry, and this is our segment every week with Brandon talking Ohio State football with plenty of recruiting and National Signing Day coming up in a couple of weeks. All right, Brandon, appreciate the time.
All right, thanks, Mark.